coal, villain or savior? On the screen, we can see Professor Cleveland Jones' profile. Good afternoon, Professor Cleveland Jones.
Hi, Cavagna. Nice to be with you again.
Great. Let me remove these things. And Professor Cleveland has some slides. Somebody
Yeah,
could please.
before I go through some slides, Cavagna, I just wanted to put a little perspective on what we're talking about because coal is very much talked about, but maybe we can set a little bit of the scenario because coal is actually a very variable fuel because obviously solid fuel, but it can be anywhere from 30 to 90% carbon, can be 0 to 50% moisture, can be 0 to 10% sulfur, which is a big problem, can be 0 to 40% ash. So you have
Good.
inorganic contaminant. So it's a very complicated thing, but obviously widely used. Production, consumption, and reserves. I'm going to talk about, but understanding that it's a much more difficult fuel to talk about than natural gas because maybe a little bit different one from the other, but not much. Oil, yeah, maybe more different, but still within some ranges. But let me share this.
Yeah, but can we consider it as a fuel or only energy for electricity?
No, as a fuel, I mean, in many countries it is used directly. Um, I say fuel because you burn it up and you boil water for turbines and generation, but it is used directly. And when we say coal, we also mean metallurgical coal because it's not just coal for electricity; it's coal for steel, and it's even coal for powering some industrial processes.
Yeah.
And obviously, where coal is used, you use it as much as possible for as many uses as possible to take advantage of its advantage, which is price. But let me just put this on here because I'm not going to talk about all of these um, individual. Are we on? Yeah. All of these numbers, but we have consumption by countries, we have production by country, and we have reserves by country. It's important to understand consumption, of course, drives the demand, and you have everybody knows China, India, and then the U.S. and a whole bunch of other countries. So that's important, but you have to understand there the giant jump from almost 5 billion tons to something like 1 billion tons for India and half a billion for the US and then way down. So there's a big discrepancy, very concentrated use. But of course, India growing very fast. Um, in terms of production, again, you know, uh, China, big producer, obviously, since it's the greatest consumer, it still has a very big deficit, so it's a big importer. India, is uh, not a great producer. And in fact, even though it's trying to increase production, it's not going to be able to match its demand. Its demand is going to explode. People are talking about 1.9 or even 2 billion tons by 2030 or 2030 something. So, it's exploding and their production is not going to keep up. The US has a lot of production, not so much consumption, so it can probably keep exporting some, but not major. The important thing to understand is that in terms of international players,
I have a short problem with the internet. Professor Cleveland, you stopped. Can you hear me? Uh, so I will try to remove you from here, and if you can enter again.
talking about is the future. And in the future, we see India exploding. But that might take a couple of years. It's adding a lot. So this shows you the importance of coal flows in trade, and this is for coal for electricity. Basically, Australia and Indonesia are the big players. If we were to talk about metallurgical coal, it would just be basically Australia. Indonesia would be a player almost, and then some other minor players. So it's a very concentrated sourcing, but it's very unlikely that you would have anything like OPEC of coal. That is very unlikely because it happens that many of the less developed countries, for example, do have possibility of using coal.
The United States reserves are the most important ones because they explored much more than others, or naturally they have more.
No, let me say this: the United States has been blessed with an abundance of coal, but it's not just the fact that its reserves are the dominant reserves worldwide. It's the quality of those reserves,
Mhm.
because coal, like I said, is so variable that when you talk about lousy coal, everybody has coal to some extent. It's just that it's not so competitive. It's not so high in calorie content, that kind of thing. But if you look at this thing, the U.S. is nowhere close to producing a lot of its potential because it's, a minor player. In fact, it produces a lot of coal, but it's a minor player. Indonesia, Australia, even South Africa, certainly Russia are much much bigger players in coal.
But when we say quality of the coal, you mean the quantity of heat per kilogram,
Yeah,
for instance? Okay.
that would be, say, the key metric. But the other metric is like I was saying before. You have a lot of coal that has ash, so you're not really burning coal. You're burning basically sand and minerals, and so they don't burn, and they detract from the heating content. But not just that, they leave a tremendous amount of ash that you have to dispose of. And so you have giant piles, not just of the regular ash, but of the mineral part of the coal that isn't carbon that has to be disposed. And that's very expensive. It's a logistical problem. You want to avoid that. And also, if you have sulfur in your coal, that's a problem. So, if you were to talk about coal, yes, it's attractive because you can still buy it inexpensively. If you look back some years, coal was trading around $100, say, up and down. Then during the pandemic, it exploded, went up to 400 or something. Yes, that hurt a lot of people, but look at this. It was a blip, went up, and just as fast it went down. So now, of course, we're 150, say. It's more expensive, but it's
And,
still
and
very
what's
cheap.
and what's the equivalence to other energies in terms of
At
energy?
least one third of the cost of
Oh,
other.
really?
So it's just very inexpensive. And if you look at in terms of capital capex for setting up a coal plant, you're talking about something like $10 to add 1 million watt hours per year.
Mm.
Um, if you compare that to solar and wind, which everybody says, oh, it's so cheap, solar and wind are around $600.
Wow.
This is incredibly cheap. Obviously, you have other costs and so on, but just setting up, it's just incredible. And of course, we can say that setting up new plants and so on, obviously, it's a major industrial project, to set up a new plant. But with these costs, it's a very attractive thing. Now, so this scenario sets up that China, for example, setting up new coal plants, but at a very reduced rate. It put together 100 and some gigawatts of new coal power plants in all of 2023. This year, so half a year or more than half a year, it only put in 10 gigawatts. Obviously, probably it's going to, increase that or something, but it's a very large deceleration of the rate of growth of coal. So you can see that, things are shifting a little bit. But uh, as a policy, for example, we talk about China because it's the biggest user. China is shifting its new coal plants, for example, to set them up way in the interior, far away from big cities, because coal,
And
is a problem.
and Germany is returning to use coal
Yeah,
intensely.
but again, as we saw up there, Germany is not a major user, and it's going to do
Yeah.
that for as long as it needs to. And when it sets up other alternatives and maybe even more LNG and some renewables, it's probably not going to emphasize coal so much. But it's a very good lesson because when everything fails, go back to coal because it's a this you can't argue with
Is
that.
it the point of energy security, you mean?
Exactly. And I think this is one of the things that I'm going to talk about because, in terms of energy security, if you have coal or if you have access to coal, being so cheap and being an alternative energy source
And
that
dispatchable.
is a
Yeah.
base power, that's fantastic because it really is like a shot in the arm for a country's electric grid. Uh,
Yeah.
Setting up a coal plant is a couple of years to set it up. It's not like licensing a nuclear power plant, even though they're both base power and very
Yeah.
important. Coal plants are much quicker.
Mhm.
Sure, more polluting, but it's important to understand some of the scenario. But um, so everybody talks about coal. Oh, the villain. Why? Because of greenhouse emissions. CO2. When you burn coal, you have a lot of CO2. At least two or more times the CO2 emissions of a gas-fired plant. If you are a if you are concerned about global warming, or if you believe that it has a direct effect, of course, that's a concern. As you know, a lot of people are not particularly convinced that it's a major source of concern or that it should be a concern, even if it is a contributor, because we have a lot of other priorities. Personally, I always talk about loss of biodiversity in the world is a lot worse problem than global warming, even with you know possible exacerbation of extreme events.
And the health concerns. Is it
That's
really?
the second part. That SOx and NOx. Emissions are not just greenhouse gas emissions. They're very significant, harmful pollution like sulfur oxides, which turn into acid rain and all kinds of problems for smog in cities and health concerns and so on. And in the case of coal, especially because many plants are still being built without precipitators for a lot of the particulate matter, that very small P2.5 and so on. The particulate pollution is indeed a very serious problem. So, in that sense, coal is a villain. There's a lot of research that has put numbers on the number of people that die every year in China and India and so on from coal emissions. Not necessarily from greenhouse emissions, but from sulfur oxides and particulate emissions. So
Mhm.
you have to say, yes, coal is a villain. If you were to set up preventive measures, precipitators and so on, yes, maybe you could handle some of that. But then, of course, you take away a lot of the advantage of the low cost. But
Mhm.
you also have the other side, on the mining side. Like any mine, coal is a product that, when mined, has a very big environmental footprint. So if you have giant mines like you have in China, in much different conditions than in the U.S., you do have an environmental problem with the mining.
Mhm.
And also, I would say a villain for whom? For the less developed countries of the world, in Africa and Southeast Asia, and even China and India, when that coal price went to the 400 and some, that hurt a lot. Of course, it was still less than an equivalent price of oil, but it hurt. So in that sense, that volatility is harmful. It's a
Yeah.
3 time growth. Not like oil prices that went up 50%. So that volatility is very high, and it's harmful. Yes,
Mhm. Mhm.
but let me say this. This picture is of a Brazilian coal seam that when I was at the university and we used to lead field trips to visit uh, various energy projects, including coal mines, we took them to an underground mine where this, that doesn't even look like coal because it actually hardly can be called coal, but is the coal that Brazil mines and burns at a large coal plant.
And what
This
about the quality of this coal in Brazil?
It's dirt. It's
Yeah.
hardly coal. 40% or 50%. It's inorganic. It's so bad, so harmful that it's burned with organic materials so that you can raise the calorie content so that the thermal power plant can operate. But
That's
this is coal
that's
that is
that's
being mined.
that's the reason that Brazil did not develop these reserves.
It's developing, and it's a very large environmental impact. Very sad situation. Lots of rivers turned into absolute disaster areas. But I understand. Once you have that going, to stop all of that is difficult in the southern state. But this is a bad example because I was associated with a visit to that mine. But this is not unusual in the world. You have many countries that mine this stuff and burn it as bad as it is because it's what they have and it's very cheap. Even though this is an underground mine and the seam is about 15 centimeters or something, and you have to chase it here and there. And imagine how much sterile material you have to get rid of to get
Yeah.
this much coal. It's incredible, but this is what the world deals with. In China, they have better coal mines, and they have access to coal mines in Mongolia, which are much better, and so on. But I wanted to point this out because people don't, they think of coal, they think of this black stuff that burns. This is coal. But then, if you look at the other side, I want to say that um, I'm not proposing that coal is wonderful and so on, but it is uh, uh, something that many countries can call a savior because coal plants can be brought into production pretty fast. It's a simple setup. Um, at basically at 60 ton per annum capex, very cheap to set up coal electricity from coal.
Mhm.
And coal mines are not necessarily developed very quickly. Like any mining, it's a long licensing and so on. But many countries in the world have excess capacity. So it's, just if you need a billion more tons in the world, a couple countries can just bring up the production or even bring back closed mines that can restart production because many were closed not because they ran out of coal, just because they didn't want to mine it anymore. But this, as you were saying, strategically or geopolitical importance, the avoidance of energy restrictions is an important concern because, oil and gas and even nuclear shutdowns restrict the country's energy. Germany had to lose its gas to go back to coal. Japan, when it lost its nuclear power plants, also went back to coal, also natural gas, but it also
Mhm.
went back to coal. So this is a savior. If it didn't go back to coal, its gas imports would have exploded, and probably prices would also. So this has been in practice, a very important savior for several countries, besides the ongoing advantage of being able to use a very inexpensive source.
Mhm.
In terms of geopolitics, um, you know, less developed countries suffer a lot of pressure from the major blocs, both from the United States and maybe from Russia and China. And if they have their own coal, or if they can import coal from somewhere else, they can more or less insulate themselves from some of this pressure. And this is important. If you are a Southeast Asian country, and you want to be free from China influence, or you don't want to be pressured into the U.S. circle, you continue burning coal. You don't have to worry about LNG from the U.S. or from the Middle East or whatever. This is an important consideration for a lot of countries, and they look at it from that standpoint. They say we are protected because we have a significant portion of our energy being generated
Yeah,
not from those conventional sources.
yeah, yeah.
And of course, we spoke in other programs about energy poverty. You look at a lot of countries in Africa, they're not going to overcome their energy poverty by going into oil and gas and renewables. They're first going to go into coal because it's an expensive way of providing new source of energy for those people, even for electricity. So there's no question that coal is, for the next 10, 20 years, is going to be an essential part of reducing energy poverty. Oil and gas will be also,
Mhm.
renewables much less so. And of course, I did mention that, as a savior, yeah, if someone says, oh, you're polluting, well, you put precipitators, you do something with
Yeah.
the ashes, and you spread them somewhere. You can deal with some of those impacts.
So on one side we have some advantage, like is a dispatchable energy and
Yeah,
no intermittent
yeah.
energy. So
Base power, that's very important for countries.
yeah,
But
yeah.
but I want to show this. Uh, this black wall, this is coal. This is American U.S. coal. 80 feet, that's almost 30 meters of a seam. We were talking about a 15 centimeter coal seam, lousy coal. This is highest quality coal.
Mhm.
How can you not say this is a savior? Because this, very few impurities, high thermal content for thermal electricity generation, you know, exposed. All you have to do is bring in those giant machines, 100,000 tons or whatever, and start mining. This is unbelievably effective, cheap, and the reserves, like we said in the U.S., are basically this kind of stuff, not bad coal. So in that sense, yes, you have to say that as long as some coal like this is available, especially for developing countries that have restrictions on the budget that they can spend on energy
Yeah.
because they're poor,
Eh,
this
eh,
is the way to go.
yeah. And what about technological advances that can mitigate the use of coal?
Well, I say using coal, if you have emissions, the CO2 capture is going to be very expensive. I don't think that's going to work. As you said, Germany went back to coal. If they're concerned about emissions, let them set up some coal capture, carbon capture projects on the stacks. They might do it. Tanzania and a lot of African countries and Southeast Asian countries are not going to bother with that. It just increases the cost 2 times. You know, maybe for particulate matter, it's precipitators, which is less expensive than carbon capture. So you could do that. But when you have coal of this quality, you don't have to worry too much. Just the CO2
Yeah.
emissions, but you don't have a lot of bad stuff coming out.
Less emissions than others.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is incredible because, when we say that Middle East has a lot of oil, good quality oil, Brazil has almost what the Middle East has in the pre-salt, and it's very high quality oil, commands a premium in the Brent premium. to bread. Yes, they're very exceptional resource bases, but in coal we have something like this.
And let's do a comparison to which what energies can replace coal. Solar is intermittent, so you cannot replace
Yeah, I
that.
mean, if
Wind, the
you're
same. Wind is the
if
same
you're
of
in the
solar.
European Union, you replace it with anything because you have money and you don't care. But if you're in Africa or Southeast Asia or even Latin America, you don't. That's why Brazil is still burning coal, despite having so much energy of other sources, because it is cheap. So it's only as the last resource that will be taken out and under great pressure from international organizations. But in terms of what can substitute it, if you look out 10, 15 years, I think the natural substitution is nuclear because that's also base power. And maybe in 10, 15,
Yeah,
20 years, that will be accessible. We're getting to the point of building reactors faster and
yeah.
licensing
But
faster.
natural gas is a good replacement, no?
Yes, it's a good replacement, but you're still talking, you know, higher cost. Not a lot higher, but higher cost.
Yeah.
Not just cost of energy, but capex, and that's the rub here. Because one thing is cost of running this thing, the other is cost of setting it up. And in fact, even though integrated gas plants. They're combined cycle. They're very efficient. They're very clean. But the capital costs are there. But it is the next most likely right now chance of substituting coal. But in the future, of course, I think that apples to apples is going to be nuclear. But right now, in terms of availability, because you can dispatch it and it can
Uh,
be at the base.
what
Yes, yes.
what's worse for the environmental concerns? Coal or oil?
Yeah, coal is going to be worse because of higher emissions, even particulate emissions, not just greenhouse gases, which I give importance, but I'm saying that's not the only concern. The concern is uh, particulate emissions and also sulfur emissions. This coal doesn't have a lot of sulfur, but other coals do, and that's a problem for uh, China. Has had many days in cities where people can't breathe and they stay home. India has the most polluted cities, some 40 days a year or 50 days a year where it's danger to your health because of coal emissions.
So do you
So
believe?
yes, it's a villain in some sense, but you have to look at more than just the effects on health and on the environment because economics, when you're talking about the resources that a country has, sometimes they top out.
Mm. So do you believe that coal has a long life
Yes,
yet,
yeah, yes.
like oil or much more than oil?
Probably like oil, but maybe coming down, not now, but later will come down faster to a lower level. But just like oil, uh, the coal age and the oil age will end, but not because we ran out of coal, and certainly not because we ran out of oil. But they will gradually come down. There's one uh, important thing to consider is that you know we talk about stranded resources. Coal will be a major stranded resource because the resources in the U.S., for example, are not going to be produced in the next 50 years or 100 years, and they will be left there because eventually we'll have nuclear or something else that will take up the space. But in the next 10, 15, 20 years, maybe you know natural gas, LNG in a lot of cases, because that is quick and it solves the problem of an energy imbalance in a lot of countries, and that's very quick. You just ship the gas there, you set up a gas plant.
And how do you see the power of people like Al Gore, California Governor Greta, to stop using coal? Do they have power to do that?
They do in the European Union. They might more so in the U.S. They might in a couple other countries, but they can scream all they want, but African countries in particular, even some South American and Southeast Asian countries, certainly India, are going to say, gee, thanks, but no thanks. We'll stick with coal because it's very cheap. And that's the way they do it. What they're doing on the positive side is using slightly more of the good coal and using plants that have better capture of particulate matter. Not necessarily carbon capture, but the fly ash, the tiny particulate matter. That is handling some of the health problems. So in that sense, say, hey, we solve some of the health problems and we keep some of the economic benefits. So this is great for the country. In that sense, it's a savior. But for the European Union and even for the U.S., I think we're seeing an irreversible trend. Even if Trump comes back, it's just not in the cards because in the U.S., gas is so cheap. The gas may indeed displace coal, and for other reasons, it's already doing so. But in less developed countries.
So the point is in the economics side. So the price is so low that you cannot live without.
And it's not going to go back to $400 or $500 because there is plenty of coal. That was more of a logistical problem and so on. So looking forward, we have plenty of resources. Russia has a lot of coal. It can increase probably production and export. So we have a lot of players, and not all. Right now Australia is dominant, but a lot of players can come in and supply countries. So that's a very safe sourcing option for many countries. That's more or less the case.
Yeah, long life for coal. There is no way to abandon coal. That's it.
That's it, Kamaya.
Thank you. Thank you so